Good evening, everyone. It is Thursday, which means it is time for the gospel according to the Pussy Pastor. I want to speak from the topic today, the power to heal yourself. I'm going to read from the gospel according to Mark, chapter 5, beginning at the 25th verse. And the text reads, Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? And the disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, Who touched me? He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. James Marion Sims is credited as the father of modern gynecology for developing pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health. Yet his research was conducted on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. During the procedure, patients were completely naked and asked to perch on their knees and bend forward onto their elbows so their heads rested on their hands. Two fistula patient cases lifted from the physician's records were that of Lucy Ann and Archer. The first young woman, he operated on was 18-year-old Lucy. She had given birth a few months prior and hadn't been able to control her bladder since. Lucy endured a long surgery, screaming and crying in pain as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. This was an hour-long surgery. As Sims later wrote, quote, Lucy's agony was extreme. She became extremely ill due to his controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine from her bladder, which led to her contracting blood poisoning. I thought she was going to die, he said. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation, he wrote. For a long time, Sims' fistula surgeries were not successful, and after 30 operations on one teenager, a 17-year-old enslaved woman named Ann Archer, who had had a very traumatic labor and delivery, he finally perfected his method after 4 years of experimentation. Afterward, he began to practice on white women using anesthesia. These experimentations speak to the perception of the inhumanity of Black people. Their bodies often put on display based on Sims' misguided belief that Black people didn't experience pain like white people did. It's a notion that persists today. Sims' use of enslaved Black bodies as medical test subjects fall into a long, ethically bereft history of medical apartheid, which includes the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks. Poor and oppressed bodies are often the subject privileged people use to secure their positions of power and influence. Their bodies, the very currency for another's notoriety. Beloved, in a world that is not always just, our pain can leave us feeling invisible. But God illuminates our power so that we can source our healing. So let's go to this text. In the Greco-Roman culture, women had distinct roles, social roles from men. Male honor depended on the public persona to win in the area of strength and wit, but also how well they asserted their authority, oftentimes over women. A woman's class was determined by her male relative, whether that be a father or a husband, possibly even a brother. Women were treated largely as peripheral adjuncts to men's lives, confining them to private domestic sphere. This woman in the text was alone, and Mark's depiction of this unaccompanied and unidentified woman speaking to Jesus in public highlights her strength and willingness to assert her power. So the first thing I want to say about this woman is that she was ready. Verse 25 says, "Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. For 12 years, this woman's condition cut her off from religious community and economic stability because she was considered unclean. She was expected to comply and carry this burden alone. 12 years of social isolation and religious restraints. 12 years of watching other people celebrate with families. 12 years of hearing miraculous news in the lives of other people. 12 years of waiting. 12 years. Verse 26 says, she had endured much under physicians. Because of the purity culture, she was forced to surrender her body to a physician before she could return to community. She didn't have autonomy or agency over her own body. Now, Dr. Bettina Judd, who's an assistant professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of Washington, points out consent isn't always about whether you can say yes. It's also whether you can say no. And these stringent social structures and belief systems did not permit this woman to say no to the rules that were set. She was literally sick and tired of being sick and tired, in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a civil rights leader, who belted out these words in 1964, her words an impassioned plea for change, as she describes the graphic detail of the vicious 1963 beating in a Mississippi jailhouse that left her with severe kidney damage, a blood clot behind her eye, and a permanent limp. This woman, any woman who is sick and tired of being sick and tired, is prepared to take action. So she was ready. Not only was this woman ready to take action, this woman was also ratchet. Now, when I describe this woman as ratchet, I'm saying she chose to lose restraint. And we all need a little ratchetness in our lives. This woman crossed the boundaries of decency by ignoring the social rules of modesty. By law, she was considered impure. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from a Birmingham jail, said, "One has a moral responsibility to disobey an unjust law." And I imagine this woman saying, "I tried to do it the right way, but they got me nowhere. So now I got to get ratchet." She didn't allow the shame society placed on her to further alienate her. And that is an important question that we can ask ourselves, which is, what are the religious laws regarding your body's expression or function that you need to disobey? Verse 27 says, she had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. This woman, who was an outcast, believed her fate was to be whole and in harmony with her own body. Now, being a social outcast is not synonymous with immorality or wickedness, which we often paint people who are outcasts in this way. This woman believed in her ability to thrive, and she initiated the first move. So I said she was ready. I said she was ratchet, and she was also real. She spoke dynamically. Verse 33 says, "But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth." For her to tell the whole truth to Jesus, she had to tell the whole truth to herself. Not that she touched Jesus, but the others who touched her. The pain, the shame, the exploitation, the trauma that she endured. Because our healing comes when we tell the truth. Those physicians touched me. They touched my naked body, and their touch didn't leave me better, but in actuality, it left me worse. And I'm not covering for them anymore. I don't care about their reputation or their prominence. They used me, they used my body, and I'm not the only one. They done used a whole slew of women. Many people are keeping their mouths shut because of shame. In Sojourner Truth's writing or her speech, Ain't I a Woman, she goes through like all that she endured at the hands of her enslavers. And she finally says, "None but Jesus heard me." This speaks to the legacy of silencing the pains of Black people. And of course, it does continue. But this woman spoke anyway. She was aware of the backlash. She was aware of how her voice would have disrupted those in power, and she spoke anyway. She told the whole truth. Verse 34 says, "He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.'" Jesus called her daughter as a familiar term because her condition cut her off from intimacy with others. And his words bring her into relationship as opposed to a person or a thing that's inspected, that her body was inspected. He brings her back into relationship. So she is restored to her personhood and not objectified. Because true intimacy gives us space for sharing so that healing can occur. No longer did her body have to hold the pain. It was now, or it could now be, a container for pleasure. Now, I read this text through a womanist lens because I am womanish, which is a term that was coined by Alice Walker. And that is that I am talking back to this text. I'm challenging it, I'm questioning it, I'm interrogating it, and I'm unafraid of the power and authority that this text may hold. Just like a girl growing up and talking back to her elders. Mama said don't talk back to grown folks, but sometimes we got to talk back, because in our talking back, we're questioning the world around us in order for us to learn how to understand and navigate it. So I got questions because, yes, Jesus, she's ready, she's ratchet, she's real, but I want to know, where are her reparations? She was healed. She was commended on her faith. She was able to return to community, but with what? She was completely bankrupt. Her wealth lied in the hands of extortionists. Jesus, you restored her, but what about her reparations? Because somebody's got to pay for this. Now, a theological basis of reparations for this woman requires an assessment of what she gave and what she did not receive. The writer highlights Jesus' healing justice, But what about this woman's economic state? And doesn't that reflect much of our society? This woman wasn't poor because she was irresponsible with her money or her body. She worked and paid physically and financially into a system expecting to have a better life. Not only the physicians need to be held accountable, but this system, which allows other people to extort money and resources, they need to make amends by returning what was stolen. And in a society where people's publicly spew all comments of heinous, sexist, racist, homophobic acts, um, and then somehow just apologize and expect to move forward without any consequences or interruptions to their life, it's just reprehensible. And my thing is, let us not even internalize this mistreatment by turning on ourselves. Like this woman, your healing is within your grasp. And my prayer is that the Creator embolden you to pursue your healing unapologetically, that the Lord remind you of your capacity to love and be loved, and may the Spirit restore what was taken so that you can be a force of nature and bring glory to your ancestors. Amen and Ashe. That concludes our time tonight. Until next time, may your souls be nourished and your bodies pleasured. Good night.